Hi, I'm Sam Edis.
And I'm Amy Nelson. Welcome to What's Her Story with Sam and Amy.
This is a show about the world's most remarkable women, their professional and personal journeys.
Together, we'll hear from gold medalists, best-selling authors, and leaders of the world's most iconic brands.
Listen every Thursday or join the conversation anytime on Instagram at What's Her Story Podcast.
Susan Cain is the author of Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, which spent 8 years on the New York Times bestseller list. Susan's TED Talk has been viewed over 40 million times. LinkedIn named her the top 6th influencer in the world, just behind Richard Branson and Melinda Gates, who's also been a What's Her Story guest. Her new masterpiece, Bittersweet, How Sorrow and Longing Makes Us Whole, is out this week.
So, Susan, your first book, Quiet, became an international phenomenon. What was it like choosing a topic for this book?
Well, I don't think I choose my topics so much. I think my topics are just a deep part of me. And I think for me, writing is a little bit like, I just thought of this metaphor just the other day. I think it's a little bit like having a message that I really want to communicate and sending the message out in a bottle, and I'm like working on the message for years and years and not really knowing if it's going to make it to the other shore. In this case, meaning not knowing at first whether other people are going to resonate with it or not, but it just feels very deeply important and true. And so I do it. So like with Quiet, it took me, I mean, when I first started working on Quiet, I thought that I was working on a very idiosyncratic project that would be kind of marginal. I had no idea that it was going to touch the gigantic nerve that it did. And now it's been really interesting with Bittersweet, where I'm talking about the creativity and the connection and the other powers that come from embracing the more bittersweet side of life. I'm getting the same kinds of messages from readers that I got from Quiet. It's almost like the same language of feeling permission to be themselves, feeling seen, feeling understood, validating a way of existence, like understanding something about themselves that they had never been able to put into words before. So it's kind of like there's an uncanny similarity, I would say, but all of it comes from that message in a bottle type of idea selection, I guess.
So, Susan, that is a specific thing, though, talking about a message in a bottle. That's not something we kind of reference a lot in our everyday life. And I noticed on your Twitter profile, you have a quote that's a C.S. Lewis quote. And you wrote, "Looking for the place where all the beauty came from." Have you always been someone, like when you were a child, were you someone who was kind of looking at the bigger picture or finding the magic or asking those questions?
Yes, honestly, I really was. I remember, I have a very distinct memory, excuse me, of being, I think I was 4 years old and suddenly being hit by the question of like, what on earth are we all doing here? Like, what is this all about? Why are we here? How should we be living? And I don't think I've ever stopped asking that question. I feel like I'm asking it almost every minute of my day.
What did you do with that? What did you do with that when you were 7?
I mean, when I was little, I was just asking it. I don't know that I did that much with it, but I guess I've just always been thinking in those terms. But, when you're reading and writing as a kid, because I was doing both a lot, like that's always been my orientation, you're much more interested just in stories and telling stories and writing stories. So that's what it was. It was really when I was older that these questions that had been swirling around in my mind all that time took shape in writing nonfiction and writing about ideas. And the quote that I have on my Twitter handle about looking for the place where all the beauty comes from, that idea is really at the heart of this new book, Bittersweet, that I've written, because to me, the essence of bittersweetness really is this state that I believe all humans come into the world with, where you kind of, you come into this world crying, right? And there is a sense, no matter how happy a life that you're living, there's a sense that we all belong in a more perfect and beautiful world, from which we've been banished. And you see that idea expressed in all of our religions, the longing for the Garden of Eden, and the longing for Mecca, and the longing for Zion, the longing for the beloved of the soul, the longing for somewhere over the rainbow in secular terms. We see this all over the place. And I believe that when we have those moments where you see something so beautiful that it brings tears to your eyes, that the tears are coming because it's triggering that longing. It's like you're seeing a glimpse of that world that we all long for. And that's part of why we love art the way we do, because it's a manifestation of that deepest human instinct.
When I read your book, it was, so many parts of it were so meaningful personally to me, but throughout my kids' childhoods, they've always said to me, "Mom, please don't cry," because I cry happy tears for every moment. And so reading it was a little bit like permission for this is healthy. This is why I cry. And just this weekend, my kids got their ears pierced for the first time, my teen daughters. And I was crying when they got their ears pierced, and my older daughter was hugging me and holding me, and they weren't crying. They were the ones experiencing the ear piercing. It's just so, the way you talk about longing and bittersweet moments, I think that it's something that everyone can relate to, no matter your personality. In your own life, what is the relationship between love and longing?
Well, I guess I'm a hopeless romantic in a certain way, and also grew up on the same diet that everybody else did of watching, kind of romantic, happily ever after films and all that kind of thing. And I think it took me a while to understand like the true nature of love relationships, whether with friends also, but especially romantic love relationships, that you could say in a way that our love relationships, that we kind of have to learn to live outside the Garden of Eden in a way, like with your friends, let's say, you start realizing, oh my gosh, like I'm dreadfully imperfect and my friends are too, and I'm going to love them in spite of that. And with romantic relationships, there's a feeling when you first enter one, especially like a deep and meaningful one, there's a feeling, especially for the first few months, where you kind of feel like, this is it. Like I found the Garden of Eden, and we found it together. And then you start to understand, well, actually my partner's not perfect. I'm not perfect. And until you understand that that's the nature of reality, you can feel like, okay, I better go to the next relationship because maybe that one will deliver me to Eden. Like, you're not thinking that in so many words, obviously, but that's what we're experiencing. So I would say like the growing up process for me really was a matter of understanding kind of the difference between what's wonderful on like in our day-to-day lives and the state of, perfection, truth, beauty, unconditional, pure love that we long for. And to understand that those two things can exist side by side.
So early on, I guess you learned that you weren't making partner after many years of working your butt off in your law firm. And that also coincided with the end of a relationship. And it seems like that explosion of sorts changed a lot of things for you.
It changed so many things for me. So I went into what I called a state of free fall at that point, because I knew kind of instinctively I probably wasn't going back to law. So I had no career suddenly, no love. I was no longer living in the same apartment that, like, I'd moved out of the apartment when I ended this relationship that had always felt wrong. And so I was kind of floating around, and I fell into a relationship with a guy who was not fully available, not fully the right person, but he was a musician and a lyricist and a lit up kind of person. And it became a kind of obsessive love of the kind I guess everybody has to go through at one point or another, but they're quite painful, I think, those relationships. And no matter what I did, I couldn't shake it until one day I sat down with a friend of mine, Naomi, who had been patiently listening to me regale her with stories of the object of this obsession. And Naomi said to me, if you're this obsessed with somebody, it's because he represents something that you're longing for. So what are you longing for? Like, what's really at the heart of this? And it really was one of these blinding, scales fall from your eyes kinds of moments, because I instantly knew that what I was longing for and what that he represented the world of writing and music and art that I had always wanted to be a part of in the first place. I was never meant to be a lawyer. And he was kind of like an emissary from that more perfect and beautiful world that I longed for. And as soon as I saw that, the obsession melted away almost cinematically. It was like it was gone. And I started really writing for real and have never looked back since. So, yeah, I guess I would say to anybody listening, if you find yourself beset by some kind of deep and existential longing, I would really examine it and try to ask yourself, like, what does it really mean beyond what it appears to mean? You may not be longing for a person or for the house you think you're longing for, or whatever it is. It may be that it represents something else to you.
At the time when you figured this out, like, was it scary? Like, you said you intuitively knew you weren't going back to law after you left Cleary, but like, gloss over that. That's a big decision, right? Because many people, if they don't make partner, they go in-house, or they stay in the law, they just pivot. Like, you made these major life changes. Was it scary?
Well, it would have been scary, but I did everything with a big backup plan, I would say. Okay. So first of all, even though I knew deep down I probably wasn't going back, I did interview for a few in-house positions and things like that. And I just couldn't bring myself to go in that direction. So what I did, I decided I really wanted to make writing the center of my life. I signed up for this class in creative nonfiction writing. I knew the night of that first class, I felt so deeply that I had found my home and my center, and that's what I wanted to be doing. But truly, I did not ever think I could make a living from writing. Like, I said to myself, if you publish something by the time you're 75, that's the goal. So I didn't think writing was going to be the thing. So what I did is I set up a little freelance business teaching people negotiation skills, especially to women, because negotiation was not something I had felt came naturally to me, but I had studied it a lot in law school and as a lawyer. So I felt like I could help other people for whom it didn't seem to come naturally. And so that was how I was paying the bills. So that made it less scary. And I always say to people, like, there's such a message in our culture that, that if you truly have a passion for the business you want to start or the art you want to create or whatever, you should be willing to chuck everything in the service of that passion and take the big risk. And I think that's the worst advice ever. Because first of all, you may fail, and that's okay. But it's not okay if you have no backup plan. But also, you can't even really mentally focus on your business or your art or whatever if you're so anxious about not being able to pay the bills. So I'm a big believer in the plan B and doing things, kind of the less glamorous but more practical way.
Then you met your now husband, and there's something about your relationship with him that's really remarkable that you learned on just the second date.
Yeah. So, okay. So when I met, and I write about all this in the book, that when I met my now husband, Ken, at the time he had just come back from, he basically spent he went to law school too, by the way, but he never practiced for a day in his life. He didn't take the bar even. And he spent the 1990s as a UN peacekeeper. He was basically like in all the war zones of the 1990s, like Rwanda and Somalia, and Liberia, Haiti, Cambodia. And he came back and he wrote this really incredible memoir of his experiences. It's called Emergency Sex and Other Desperate Measures, a True Story from Hell on Earth. It's really, really great. And so when we met, he was just publishing this book, and it was a bestseller, and and it was this really important work. And meanwhile, I had this failed legal career, and at the time I was writing a memoir in sonnet form because that's what I was doing. And I came to our second date, and I brought some of the sonnets with me. And later that night, I could actually get up and show it to you. I have it here in my office still, but later that night, he sent me this email, and I have it reprinted in the book. He basically wrote in this email, like in these gigantic letters, holy shit, drop everything, right woman, right. And it was just like the most amazing encouragement, and expressed in his very typically exuberant fashion. And that's why it's framed in my office all these years later. And all these years later, I would say he's still my biggest cheering section and gets even more excited than I do, when my new book, Bittersweet, came out, I don't know, maybe a week or so ago as we are taping this, and it seems to be doing really well, and he's really excited and checking Amazon constantly. So it's still like that all this time later.
Too bad more people don't marry their biggest cheerleader.
Very, very true. That is so. Yeah. But I also will say that part of what I teach people from all the years that I've spent working on introversion and extroversion for my first book, Quiet, is to understand that different people express enthusiasm differently. So like one of the things in our relationship is I have had to learn when something good happens for him to kind of amp up the way my enthusiasm, or like not what I feel, but the way I express it, I have to amp up because I'm just naturally kind of more muted in the way I talk about things than he would be. And then he's had to learn, I think, that I'm never going to express it the way he would. And that doesn't mean that I don't care. And so I think understanding those temperamental differences between partners is really life-saving for a partnership.
Now, there are other relationships in our lives that are that center us and are core to who we are. And you have a complicated relationship with your mother.
Mm-hmm.
How does that impact your life, your work, your parenting, all of those things?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I wrote about this in the book in Bittersweet that basically I mean, it's such a long and deep story, too much to kind of go into now. I'll just sort of give the nutshell version, and then we could talk about the impact. But basically, my mother and I, like I had a kind of Garden of Eden, to use that word again, a Garden of Eden childhood of like a really, really deep and loving relationship with my mother. And then adolescence hit us with gale force winds. And I guess that's very common for many mothers and daughters in adolescence, but our situation was, imagine the typical times 100. And so after that, there was a deep way in which our relationship seemed never to be the same again, until a kind of storybook ending that I wrote about in her later years. But all those years where it seemed never to be the same again, it was like my life was really doing so well in so many ways, and yet I had this thing. It was like this. It was like a grief that I had never mourned. So I couldn't even speak about my mother without crying. Like if you said to me, "Where did your mother grow up?" and my answer would have been, "My mother grew up in Brooklyn." I couldn't say those simple words without crying, because I couldn't speak of her without crying, because that's how intense the loss of that primary, most fundamental love was. Like I guess the first love relationship you have, the most intense one, it becomes it becomes symbolic of all love for a while. And so that's what it was like for me. And I think that's part of what led to me exploring all the ideas in Bittersweet of like because we all are going to lose love at some point, whether it's through a relationship ending or bereavement, or divorce, or, there's 1,000 different ways that it can happen. And how do we face that? What do we do with that? And the thing that I really did learn over time, because I really did come to a place of, let's say, 98 or 99% healing from it, I think. But I really did come to a place of understanding that really love is the essence, and love exists in infinite forms. So you can lose one particular love relationship, and whether you get it back again later, as I did with my mother, or not, love itself has a way of returning in many different forms. And that's what I really came to understand.
You had so much guilt wrapped up in the relationship with your mother, and you blamed yourself for so much of it for so long. What role does guilt play in your life today?
I would say guilt is still my Achilles heel emotionally, because that was because that was so much the mechanism of what went wrong, I guess, in this most formative relationship. Still today, when something goes wrong, I will immediately assume that I did something wrong, or somebody, if I'm in a conflict with someone, and the other person is, saying you've done such and such, like I automatically assume that's right times 10. That's my first emotional place that I go to, because I have thought about this a lot, and worked on this a lot. I can often remove myself from that place and then come to a place that sees things a little more clearly. But I do think that for all of us, whatever is the primary mechanism of like an emotional issue that we had early in life, that does become a kind of Achilles heel for life, or a sort of siren song for life, and that you can work through it, but it's always going to be there, underlying. And so you have to be aware of that and aware of those tendencies in yourself. But I will say, like, you asked me about my relationship with my children. I've been like really thrilled to see that I think I've replicated none of it with my children. I'm pretty sure they would agree with that statement. My boys are teenagers now. We still get along famously. And the difficulty that my mother had during my adolescence, when I started to separate as an adult, I'm not experiencing it. I truly don't feel it. So therefore, I don't think any of those dynamics are getting replicated. And I will say that I swore to myself when I was a teenager and I saw how much trouble my mother was having with me growing into independence, I swore to myself that I would have a fulfilling and meaningful career, because I've always felt that my mother wouldn't have struggled and suffered the way she did if she had had that. So I do think that's helped me a lot. And I think that helps with empty nest. It helps with everything to have sort of deep passions that exist apart from your deep passion for your family.
You talk a lot about parenting in your book, and how we try to parent the sadness out of our children.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think we can overcome that?
It's really hard to overcome it. I do think we can, but it's hard to overcome it. And I remember my mother-in-law. I'm really close with my mother-in-law. She's a very, she's really fun. She's very upbeat, and she's also, at the same time, she has sort of my husband's very exuberant temperament. They're very similar that way. But she's also, like Samantha, like me, she's a huge Leaky Faucet. We actually joke that I should have called this book Leaky Faucet, the bittersweet book. Like, she'll tear up at the drop of a hat. So anyway, she just randomly told me right after my son was born, my first one, she's like, it's really hard when your kids are upset about something, because we know what we can handle. So we can handle our own troubles. But when it's your child's troubles, you kind of don't know exactly at first what they can handle. So not only are you experiencing it vicariously, but you're experiencing it in an amplified form. And I do think that makes it really tough as parents when our kids are crying or going through a tough time. You just feel, if you're not careful, you can feel all of that as if it's filling up the whole world. But I tell this story in the book of a very small trouble that my kids went through, and how normalizing sadness was so helpful. And the story is that when they were really little, we rented this house in the countryside for a week. And right next to the house was a field in which lived 2 donkeys. And the kids fell in love with these donkeys. Their names were Lucky and Norman. And they spent all day, every day, feeding them carrots. And it was bliss. And then came the last 2 days of the vacation, where they start realizing that we're going to have to go home and say goodbye to the donkeys. And they start crying themselves to sleep. Like, they're just totally bereft. Because, of course, that kind of goodbye to a young child signifies all goodbyes. And they don't know it. It's kind of like symbolic of mortality itself. They don't know that technically, but that's what they're reacting to. And so, your kid is crying at night, and you're like trying to comfort them. So we're saying all the things of like, well, maybe we'll come back next year and you'll see them again. Someone else will come and take care of the donkeys, and nothing is helping until we say to them, this is actually part of life, this sadness, and you won't feel it forever, but you're going to feel it again. You felt it before, you felt it, you're going to feel it again. Everybody feels it. This is part of what life is. And just know that. And you'll feel better in a few days. But it was like the normalizing of the sadness was the only thing that made them stop crying, because especially for children who are growing up in relative comfort, they are sent the message that life is what's happening, that real life is when everything's going well, and that the moments where you're saying goodbye, or the moments of sickness, or the moments of bereavement, or whatever it is, that those are the moments that are, God bless you, that those are the moments that are detours from real life. And so of course then they're going to be resisting all of that, because we're not supposed to go in the detour. But if you can help them see that this is all part of the experience, it doesn't make it less sad, but there's less resistance to it.
I love that mentality. When I read that, I thought, oh gosh, I wish I'd had that. Amy, it's not too late for you. We're very
How old
little
are
girls, and she can still impose this amazing philosophy on them. But I remember one of my daughters just always crying when people would leave, right? And she had like
Yeah.
a really hard time with goodbyes. And I am sure I said all the first things you said, right? We're going to see them again soon, and you're just trying to fix it, as opposed to goodbyes are really hard, and goodbyes are a part of life, and it's always hard. And I think that that's just such a beautiful idea, and there's so many things you can apply that to.
So many
great.
things, yeah. And there's that poem, I think I put it in the book. It's one of my favorites from Gerard Manley Hopkins. It's called Spring and Fall, and he's writing it from the 19th century, and he's writing a poem to a little girl who's crying because the leaves in autumn are falling from her favorite meadow, this meadow called Golden Grove. And he says, Margaret, are you crying for Golden Grove? No, Margaret, are you grieving for Golden Grove unleaving, like the leaves falling down? And then he says, it's the blight that man was born for. It is Margaret you mourn for. And oh my God, like I can't say that without goosebumps, even though I've read it a million times, like just the truth of that. But there's a kind of bliss in knowing the truth and knowing that you share it with all the other humans out there.
That's really amazing. My girls are little.
How
They're
old?
7. My girls are 7, 6 today, 4, and 2.
Oh my gosh, how do you look so wide awake, for one thing?
No, it's magic. No, no, but I think it's like my girls, because of the pandemic, have lived in 3 different states, and I try to tell them, and they know that I have all these friends from all over the world, and I've lived in all these different places, and I try to tell them, you'll meet lots of people along the way. Some will stay with you. Some will be there for a minute. And you might miss them, but you'll take something from that. But I think also, it is really important to say the second part, Sam, that you were saying it's hard. Maybe you didn't say to Ella or Ruby, like that it is okay to hurt when you miss them. And, I keep trying to look back at my own childhood and remember what my parents told me, and I can't remember. But yeah, there's a lot to it.
Yeah. And also the idea that, and this too shall pass, like to let them know that it's natural to feel the sadness, but you won't actually feel it forever. Because I think that's part of what they're thinking too. They're like, oh my God, this is life from now on. I will always be this sad. So to know that that won't last.
There's such a delicate message in your book for parents, right? Because it's not that you want parents to ignore their kids' feelings and say, oh, crying's part of life. You go off and cry. That's kind of the opposite of what you're saying. You're saying when they're crying, help them assign meaning to that and help them accept what the pain is. And I think that so often as parents, we do the pendulum one way or the other. We try to wipe away the tears, or we ignore children. And I think it's so important to thread that needle. In many ways, I think your next book could be a parenting book because there is so much there that can be applied to parenting. And similarly, by the way, I actually thought that there was a book I used to give to people when they had experienced grief and the death of a loved one. And I think that in many ways, your book can now be that book because there's so much in there about grief and how to manage grief. And I think it's so healthy, the perspective you share.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting because, it didn't start out as a book about grief, and I don't think about it as explicitly a grief book. It started out really as, what it really started out as is like me trying to answer the question of why it is that so many of us have such an intense and intensely pleasurable reaction to sad music. I was trying to figure out how on earth that could possibly be. And it kind of set me off on this quest for years and years, looking at this bittersweet tradition of like all these religions and artists and writers who have been talking about this for thousands of years, about the way in which our melancholy sides are connected to our deepest creativity and our deepest communion, and to a sense of the divine even. Whether you're secular or atheist, there's like, doesn't matter. There's some sense of longing for some higher state. And all of this is connected with melancholy. So the book started out as that inquiry, but of course you can't really look at that subject without thinking about bereavement and about how like mortality and impermanence is really at the heart of what melancholia is. It's like an intense awareness of life's impermanence at every moment. I was thinking that when you were crying about, Sam, when you were crying about your daughter getting her ears pierced, I think part of the reason that we cry at moments like that is that those milestones are just, they're places along the way where we are reminded that this is but a moment in time. That's all it is, and it won't last. She was getting her ears pierced on that day, and she's not going to do it ever again.
Yep.
That's where the tears come from, but they're kind of they're beautiful tears.
Yeah, so true. We talk so much about the sort of typical milestones of parenting and childhood, of first steps and losing teeth, and there are just so many markers along the way that are so poignant that have nothing to do with those, giant health milestones. And I think we don't talk enough about them.
Yeah.
I'm a swimmer, and I saw my oldest daughter swim butterfly for the first time the other day, and I started crying. And it's like she's swimming a lap in a pool. It's not that. But it was this, that was my stroke. And it was this like, to me, it was this marker of her moving on her own into these things and doing hard things. Like the butterfly is not enjoyable.
Right.
Right. But
Right.
these hard things. And that makes her own person even more than I had previously thought.
Yeah. And I actually had goosebumps as you were saying that about her doing the butterfly, but also something about the fact that she was doing your stroke and your sport, like the communion of that. There's something incredibly moving about it.
Yeah. Well, we're going to now go to this speed round, Susan, where we're going to ask you just a few questions and you can give us quick answers.
Okay. And I'm terrible at this, by the way, because I can never think of the thing on the spot. So we'll see how I do.
Okay, we'll start. Okay. What book are you reading right now?
Oh, God. Honestly, I'm not reading a book right now, I don't think. Wait. I'm looking in my Audible because I feel like I just downloaded something. I told you I'm terrible at this. Oh, right. Yeah. I just downloaded Who by Fire, which is a book about Leonard Cohen. It just came out by the author Maddie Friedman. And from reading Bittersweet, I'm kind of obsessed with Leonard Cohen, and I even dedicated the book to him. Especially like the line from Anthem, his song Anthem, which is there's a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in. So that's like my life philosophy and the philosophy of this book too. So anyway, this new book just came out about Leonard Cohen, and I of course had to read it right away.
What was the last thing that made you cry? It's so funny because this happens to me so frequently that now I can't even think of one. But I don't know. I'm just going to say I think of tears and goosebumps in the same category. Goosebumps are maybe like a slightly milder version of the same phenomenon. And I just had them about 5 times during this conversation. That's good.
Who leaves you starstruck?
I mean, musicians do all the time, like every single day, because there's not a day that I'm not like sitting down and listening to music. So they're constantly leaving me starstruck. There's a musician named Benjamin Clementine whose song Condolence I was just listening to the other day. I actually put together this bittersweet playlist that goes along with my book. So you can find it if you're curious on Spotify or Apple Music. And I have that song on the playlist. It's really beautiful.
What kind of sleeper are you?
I used to be an amazing, amazing sleeper, and I was very dedicated to getting my 8 hours and everything. I have to say now that I In my middle years, I have a lot of trouble sleeping. I'm trying to figure that out.
So do you fall asleep easily?
I fall asleep easily, but then I wake up during the night and then it's hard to get back to sleep.
Okay,
So
Susan,
I
I'm gonna
actually,
give you my trick. Okay, here's my trick. 'Cause I have the
okay,
exact
tell
same
me, tell
thing.
me.
And we don't have to put this in necessarily, but my trick is that I have a Kindle basically in my bed with me. And so if I wake up, instead of going through like a rotisserie of worries, which keeps you up longer, I just start reading a book and I immediately fall back to sleep.
Me too. Although I don't read it, I listen to it. But same thing. I do the exact same thing.
Oh, that's
Yeah, and I've
awesome.
actually been I'm always relieved when the studies come out saying cell phones don't really cause cancer because I've been sleeping with mine for 5 years because of what you just said.
Well, Lou Burns is our male perspective, and he always joins us at the end of the show with often
Hi,
the
Lou.
most important question.
I'm sorry, your last comment was very funny. I really like your. First off, thank you so much for being on our show. I really
Thank you for having me.
welcome. I really like your perspective on introverts. I have a 13-year-old daughter. I'm trying to figure out exactly where she falls in this category, but on certain days, she's a certain way. So I'm just gonna leave it alone. But
Do you ever ask her about it? Do you ever ask her what she thinks
I'm
she is?
trying not to lead her. You know,
Yeah, I
because-
can see that.
because I'm not really good all the time at asking her questions without trying to lead her in a direction. There was this
Well-
one person that we interviewed who said just ask a question, and then if they give you a short answer, just say tell me more. I can't remember the lady's name, but that usually helps me. But yeah.
I find there you have to like figure out which are the activities where your child is more likely to tell you more. Like I've noticed with my boys who are teenagers, like if we go and play catch while they're throwing the football, they're so much more forthcoming than at any other moment.
Wow.
So I don't know what it is for your daughter, but
Maybe it's candy. Quick story.
get her in a good mood.
I got her to walk when she was about 14 months, almost 14 months, with Skittles. So she's
Oh
motivated
wow,
by
you had like a
sugar.
trail of Skittles.
No,
That
just
sounds
in
like a
my
little
hand,
fairy
just in the
tale.
palm of my hand. Yeah. It
Wow.
was beautiful.
Wow.
I got a tattoo of Dora the Explorer to remind me of that moment because Dora the Explorer was playing in the background in our living room at the time. So, I guess
That's
that's
such
a
a great
bittersweet
story.
moment. Wow, I didn't realize I was connected the two. Ha, that's cool. I'm more focused on your Wall Street lawyer lifestyle. I wanted to know.
Okay.
I wanted to know around about that time, or even now, a person like you who's transitioned from that lifestyle to now being a writer and speaker. What are you invested in? Because you're going to make millions from this amazing book. And what is a person like you? What do you do with that?
Oh my God. Seriously, I am the worst person to ask this question of. I wish I had something useful to say, but I was the least likely Wall Street lawyer. I did not know the difference between a stock and a bond when I first started. I would go home on the weekends and I had these books, like a book called Wall Street Words, which was literally like a dictionary of terms. And I would study it by candlelight on the weekends because I didn't know anything. And yeah, I remember like being, when you're a junior associate lawyer, they assign you these clients. And I remember being on the phone with one of them and he was a banker and I didn't understand what he was talking about. I was just like writing it down as fast as I could so I could decipher it later. And I know, Amy, you're laughing because probably you had moments like this at some point.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, during those years that I did all this, like I learned to speak the language and I was kind of proud of myself for learning it. But now that I don't do that anymore, and I haven't since 2001, I don't pay any attention. So, when you find out the answer, please tell me. Because, yeah, I should pay much more attention than I do.
But Lou, actually, there is so much great parenting stuff in Susan's book, and I feel like some of Lou's right now in an interesting spot in his own life because his daughter has just come to live with him, and she's a teenager, and so maybe you could share some of your pearls of wisdom of parenting a teenager and gaining a teenager's trust throughout such a difficult life phase.
Ooh, that's a
that
good
teenagers are
question,
going
Sam.
through.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my big thing is, and I don't even know if the following thing is only about teenagers. I think it's about people in general, but to really not have judgment. You just want to understand, you don't want to judge. And I think that if you approach a teenager that way, they're just much more likely to let you in and open up and keep the relationship healthy because you're communicating to them without even having to say it in so many words that you're just totally on their side. And then when you do have to set limits of like, you probably really shouldn't do such and such thing. I don't think it's in your best interest. They know that you're not coming from a place of judgment. You're not coming from a place of overreaction. You're just like reasoning it through with them. So, yeah, I just heard something the other day. What was the formulation? I don't know. It was a quote I came across and I wrote it down, but it was basically something about like in all conversations or anything you read, you should be reading or having the conversation not to form an opinion, but to understand. And I think if we all use that metric in our civic life too, we'd be so much better off. Definitely with our teenagers.
Sam gave me some great advice about telling my daughter when she tells the truth, she can never get in trouble. So I've been reiterating this to her to instill it in her so that when something does happen, she can actually tell the truth and know that she can't get in trouble. I guess that would be a form of like not judging her, because if she does something, I'm not like, why did you do that? Da, 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 da. I'm just letting it go,
Well, and they're actually, you can say, why did you do that? But I think it's more about the spirit in which you say it. It's like, why did you do that? I'd love to know what you were thinking when you made that choice, as opposed to, why'd you do that? The words are the same, but
women are so amazing. You said the exact same thing, but just in a different, loving way. I'm like trying to go down her throat. Like, what you want? And you just like, why did you do that? With the smile and everything. See if it works. I'm gonna try it today.
But I don't think it's so much about like the, like memorizing a tone of voice. I think it's more about like what's the spirit that in which you're saying the questions, because you're Lou and I'm me, and so we're going to say things differently, and that's the way it should be. But if they know you're coming with that spirit, then she'll open up to you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Susan, thank you so much. This was so enjoyable.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for all of the amazing work that you do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Thank you. Sam, I have to say that I almost cried about 72 times talking with Susan.
I know. I have to say that I had no idea I would relate to her book so deeply and her messages so deeply. And I really think everyone would benefit from understanding it. I think we see the world in black and white so often, right? Like that person's a happy person, that person's a sad person, that person's a dark person, that person's a light person, or that person is optimistic and that person's pessimistic. And really, after reading her book, and just listening to her in our conversation, it makes you realize that like the ideal is to blend those things and accept all of it.
I think that's a really profound takeaway to a profound message. Life is bittersweet. All of it. A single day can be bittersweet. An emotion can be bittersweet. And I think we want everything to be happy, and it's not, right? And even the parts where we talked about parenting, because my kids are so little, that really resonated with me. to prepare them and arm them with the fact that bittersweet is okay, sadness is okay, longing is okay. They bring into sharp clarity the good parts, and they show that you care. And somehow we've gotten away from that as a society, that we should have those feelings and that we should embrace them and that they're okay.
Right. Well, if you think about it, it's like all we do now is like push pills on people to make them happier. Or, there's a zillion books on happiness, and it really makes you realize that what if we just accepted all of the emotions and allowed people to feel more? Maybe that would make them more fulfilled and happier, right?
It could. Thanks for listening to What's Her Story with Sam and Amy.
We would appreciate it if you'd leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, connect with us on social media at What's Her Story Podcast.
What's Her Story with Sam and Amy is powered by my company, The Riveter, at theriveter.co, and Sam's company, Park Place Payments, at parkplacepayments.com.
Thanks to our producer, Stacey Para, and our male perspective, Lou Burns.